Hi there. Welcome to Designing Infrastructure Deployments for Amazon Web Services. In this video series, we're going to be talking about the subject of moving your applications and services and systems from on-prem into the cloud, specifically Amazon Web Services, and what are going to be some of the questions that you're going to have to ask. What are going to be some of the topics that you're going to have to consider when designing out these particular applications, because you cannot do the exact same things that you did for your on-prem or data centers as you would do inside of the cloud. There are a lot of efficiencies of scale or capabilities and features that the cloud provides that you do not get inside of a on-premise data center. So when talking about that, we want to look at first, how are you going to gather your requirements? What kinds of questions are you going to ask? So in so doing, we're going to talk about how to define your applications and system resources, but define them within the scope of the cloud rather than defining them within the scope of your data center. And that is absolutely going to change because there are a lot of new services, capabilities that are available within the cloud that are much harder for you to define within the scope of a data center. For example, within a just standard network infrastructure, you probably will not have to worry about load balancers and purchasing of, say, F5 type third-party environments for your applications. You won't have to worry about web application firewalls that you would have to purchase from Barracuda, because a lot of those are now available either as virtual appliances or Amazon provides these kinds of things as services. Now, not all of them are available as services from Amazon, but some of them are. So how you look at defining your applications and systems will absolutely be different. We'll look at how to define the requirements for high availability. Is that high availability within the scope of a single region, or is it going to be multi-region? Are we looking at high availability across different types of services, things of that nature, as well as how to define when a particular resource is no longer healthy. And then lastly, for those particular systems that require geographic redundancy, where you need to worry about traffic routing around the world, then you need to look at things like the DNS service and geographic redundancy and geographic availability, high availability within the scope of AWS. So with that as a backdrop, let's, in the next video, start to ask some of those questions that I was talking about and start to understand what you need to know in order to gather your requirements for a deployment inside of AWS. The first thing that you're going to want to ask is, what are you architecting for? Now, what I mean by that is there are a number of different types of categories that systems will fall into when being put into the cloud. Is this a simple lift and shift where you've got an existing application, you don't want to touch it, you don't maybe even have the ability to touch it because it's a third-party system, and you just want to pick it up and move it as close to as is as possible inside of AWS? In a lift and shift, you still want to try and take advantage of the resources and features that are available inside of AWS, but still keep as much of the infrastructure or architecture the same. Do you potentially want to do some application modernization? Maybe this is a homegrown system that you developed yourself. And so do you then have the ability to potentially make some modifications to take advantage of maybe some services or features that AWS provides? For example, maybe you don't want to have to manage and maintain your own database environment. AWS provides a number of database environments where they will absolutely maintain the operating system, maintain the database software. All you have to do is connect to it and put your data into it. That will absolutely help you modernize your application and provide you a lot of great efficiencies of scale, especially around administration and management. Maybe you just want to extend your application on-prem. I'm actually working with a customer right now where they're going to be keeping their database on-prem for privacy reasons, for security reasons, but they want to extend the front end of their application into AWS and into the cloud. That is absolutely something that would change the architectural requirements for your application because it would require a connection from AWS to on-prem. is this a completely brand new application where you're designing from the ground up in the cloud? Now, we will not be covering this inside of this particular course, but I did at least want to bring it up as this is something that you need to think about when architecting your environments for the cloud. If it's brand spanking new, take as much advantage of the AWS services and features as you possibly can. Next thing, is this infrastructure as a service, or is this PaaS as a service, platform as a service, or can it be a hybrid? Now, in this particular course, I'm going to be focusing primarily on infrastructure, but this is something that you should also understand. What are the differences between infrastructure as a service and platform as a service? Infrastructure, you're going to have to manage and maintain everything. AWS does have a certain level of management and maintenance for their services, but for the most part, it's going to be on you to manage and maintain the operating system, the software, the code, all of the monitoring and logging. All of that will have to be taken care of by you. AWS provides a lot of that, but it's still going to be up to you to manage your architecture. In platform as a service, they take some ownership. This is huge. The very first thing, in my opinion, that every person should understand when they deploy their applications into a cloud environment, AWS or otherwise, architect for the minimum. This is where you're going to reduce your costs because you no longer have to plan for what is going to be your largest load for your application anymore. Because in a data center environment, you always have to worry about planning for your hardware. In a cloud environment, you don't. You have the ability to allow for auto-scaling to occur. Therefore, when a particular system gets hit, it gets a large load for a small piece of time. You can spin up new resources, handle the load, spin them back down again. Are there any security and compliance requirements that you need to take into account? Is your application maybe an e-commerce system, for example, where you need to take into account PCI compliance? Maybe this is the healthcare or finance industry where maybe PCI and PII is in play here. Maybe you have to meet HIPAA rules. Maybe you're a government agency and you have to meet FedRAMP and FISMA. Those are some of the things that you need to take into account when architecting not only just the base infrastructure, but how the data is going to sit, how the data is going to transmit, all of those kinds of things, and being able to document all of that. DevOps. Now, DevOps is a huge term, one that I personally don't like, but it is the standard term for everyone to understand how the developers and operations work together to provide a feedback loop to each other so that applications can continuously update. Now, if this is a third-party environment, you're only worried about the operations side more than likely because you're going to be allowing the third-party system, say Oracle, for example, to provide you updates for the software. But you need to be able to still monitor and maintain that particular deployment. So within a DevOps environment, are we talking about CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment? Do you own this code, and how are you going to continually update your code into your environment, whether you're using a AWS system for CI/CD or whether you're going to use something third-party like Jenkins or even Microsoft's Azure DevOps? How are you going to do your monitoring and logging? AWS provides a great set of tools that fall under CloudWatch as well as CloudTrail that will allow you to get started very, very quickly and rapidly for monitoring and logging of your environment. But what can it provide, and do you need anything more than that? If you own the code, maybe you need an application performance management system on top of that, such as maybe App Dynamics, for example. And then lastly, configuration management. If you're going to be owning the infrastructure, which is what we're going to be focusing on in this course, then how are you going to continually update those servers? Are you going to be setting up something along the lines of a Chef or a Puppet? Are you going to be doing automatic updates for the operating system, for the database server, for the application server, so on and so forth? How are you going to make sure that each of those servers also have the same level of configuration as each other? Configuration management. AWS has one that you can take advantage of called OpsWorks, but you also can take advantage of your existing third-party environments such as Chef, Puppet, Ansible, and so on. So with all of this as a backdrop, let's now take all of this information that we've learned about what questions we need to ask ourselves with respect to requirements gathering for the cloud. And let's take a look at some of the common architectures and services that you're going to be deploying from an infrastructure perspective inside of AWS. What are some of the common infrastructure services that AWS provides? And I'm going to give you a quick demonstration of this inside of the AWS console. But let's focus on the standards that we're going to be talking about in this course for infrastructure deployments. Amazon EC2 is going to be your compute. That's your virtual machines, of which AWS has a very large listing of different configurations depending upon what types of applications you're going to be deploying. But that's going to be your base compute. Attached to that, of course, will be disks to provide your data storage for each of your VMs. But then each of those VMs will then sit inside of a Amazon virtual private cloud or a virtual network. That's where you're going to find your private networking, your IP range, and you're going to place and segment your VMs accordingly within that network. If you're extending on-prem, that network will be connected back to your on-prem data centers so that you can flow traffic back and forth from on-prem into AWS in a very private manner. You may also need to have a third-party, or not a third-party, but a secondary storage for things like configuration files, static images, things along those lines, and a publicly accessible one because Amazon S3 is their storage environment, and it does have a public endpoint that can be associated with it. Now, when we start to talk about high availability, we're going to look at elastic load balancers. When we talk about traffic routing, we'll look at Amazon Route 53. And then in reference to DevOps and your monitoring and logging, we'll be looking at Amazon CloudWatch. Now, to kind of give you an idea of how this all comes together, here's an example application design where we have a backend database. And in this particular case, I'm actually defining the database to be in Amazon RDS, or Remote Database Service, which is Amazon's platform as a service for MySQL, SQL Server, and others, for you to be able to remove the management and maintenance of the database's operating system and database's software, but still provide database functionality. That database can then easily be connected to virtual machines with Amazon EC2. It could be connected to containers and a container cluster engine, such as Amazon's EKS. It could also be touched by an IoT environment, Internet of Things, using Amazon's IoT Core. So there are a lot of different ways that you can actually take advantage of these architectural services that Amazon provides to build out your application. This is just an example. There are many, obviously, different configurations. With that as a backdrop, let me stop here. In the next video, I want to walk you through a demonstration of the Amazon Management Console, which is where you're going to actually be creating and managing all of the services to make up an architecture like you're seeing here. I'm not doing this to actually walk through the creation of each one, but more to show you each of the different categories and what all services are available within these categories of compute, networking, and storage, and so on. So I'll see you next time.